How amusing! For my father! I lost. I'm just getting started! Durandal! I won't lose! I won't!
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mangs, and it's time for another Fire Emblem character spotlight. Today we are taking a look at the main character of one of my favorite Fire Emblem games of all time, Binding Blade. This fiery redhead caught the attention of the West when he showed up alongside Marth in Super Smash Bros, and this is one of the main factors that led Fire Emblem to expand its influence beyond Japan. I dare say that alongside Marth, this guy is probably one of the most recognizable and iconic Fire Emblem lords in the franchise. Today, we take a look at the young lion from Lycia, Roy.
Roy's our boy!
Roy is the main protagonist of Fire Emblem Binding Blade, the sixth installment in the series. He is the son of Eliwood from Blazing Sword, and depending on who Eliwood marries in that game, Roy's mother can be either Ninian, Lyndis, or Fiora. Roy grew up in Castle Fera under the tutelage of his father. His earliest instructor was Marcus, who taught him the basics of swordplay. Roy also spent a lot of time with his childhood friend Voltz, whose mother, Rebecca, also acted as Roy's wet nurse. As a teenager, Roy was sent off to Ostia as an exchange student to study military tactics under Mage General Cecilia. He was initially undergoing training to become a mage, but Cecilia noted that Roy had no talent for magic, so he was trained to wield a sword instead. While in Ostia, Roy developed a strong friendship with Hector's daughter, Lilina. When Roy was 15 years old, war broke out across Alib, as King Sephiel of Bern suddenly invaded the neighboring nations of Sekei and Ilia, brutally massacring everyone in his path. After conquering the two nations, his army marched into Lycia, where they were met by the leader of the Lycian army, General Hector. Hearing of the invasion, Eliwood, who was currently bedridden with an illness, immediately sent a message to Roy, calling him back from his studies in Ostia to help defend his homeland. Once Roy arrived, he found that Lycia was being ravaged by bandits taking advantage of the chaos, and had to retake his own castle before meeting up with his father. After ensuring that Fera was secure, Roy headed off with a small army to meet up with General Hector in Arafan. On the way, he encountered a young woman who turned out to be the sister of King Sephiel of Bern, Guinevere. Guinevere had escaped Bern's army after trying to convince her brother to stop the invasion. Believing her tale, Roy brought her along, hoping that she would help him treat with the Mad King. At Castle Arafan, General Hector and his army fought bravely against Bern, but they were overwhelmed by their elite forces commanded by the two Dragon Lords, Brunya and Narshan. Additionally, Bern had brought with them a terrifying creature, a war dragon created by Sephiel's dark priestess Aiden. The dragon engulfed a large portion of the Lycian Alliance army in flames, sealing Hector's defeat. Inside Castle Arafan, Hector squared off in single combat against Narshan and Brunya, and while he put up a good fight, he was eventually defeated and shown into a dungeon to die. Roy sadly reached Arafan too late, as most of Bern's forces had already left, leaving only a small token force behind to hold the forge. After retaking it, Roy found General Hector in the dungeons, gravely injured. With his dying breath, Hector told Roy to lead the Lycian Alliance army in his place, and to protect his daughter, Lilina, who was currently residing in Ostia. Respecting Hector's last wishes, Roy traveled to Ostia to find Lilina, but on his way there he got word that a rebellion had broken out. General Legans and his lieutenant Devious had staged a coup in Ostia following Hector's death, attempting to sell Lycia out to Bern. They had taken Lilina hostage and thrown her in a cell, and they planned to kill her off in the heat of the battle to use her as a scapegoat for the rebellion. Roy and his army marched into Ostia and did battle with the rebels, and after a bloody confrontation, Legans was ultimately defeated and Lilina was rescued from her cell. After routing the rebels, Roy was met outside in Ostia by Narshan and his Wyvern riders, but as he was about to get slaughtered, General Percival and Cecilia showed up with the Etrurian army to fend them off, forcing Narshan to retreat back to Bern. After the failed Ostian coup, Etruria took Lycia under its protection and named Roy the leader of the newly formed Lycian Defense League, which only had one purpose: to protect against further attacks from Bern. However, following the events in Ostia, Bern suddenly ceased its aggression altogether, remaining eerily quiet. Slowly but surely, the war was thought to be over, and things were starting to return to normal. Sometime later, Roy received a direct order from the capital of Aquilia. He was to travel to the Western Isles, which was currently being colonized by Etruria, who oversaw a mining operation there. Roy was to use his standing Lycian defense army to fend off some bandits attacking the miners. While he disliked leaving his homeland with Byrne so recently having attacked, he had no choice but to obey the commands of Etruria, as Lycia was under their protection and thus also their rule. On the Western Isles, Roy discovered the truth that Etruria was actually enslaving the native population, forcing them to work in the mines, often until their death. Many of the so-called bandits were actually not thugs at all, but resistance forces, rebelling against Etruria's colonization. After learning of Etruria's horrendous actions, Roy saw no choice but to attack the colonization forces and free the local people from their enslavement, even if it meant going against his ally. On the islands, Roy would encounter a bard by the name of Elfin, who was with the resistance forces. When Elfin saw that Roy was attacking the colonization forces, he joined the Lycian Alliance army as a tactician. In reality, Elfin was actually the lost prince of Etruria, Mildane, who was thought to be dead after an assassination attempt many years prior. Elfin would help Roy in his travels by using his bardic knowledge to reveal the locations of the divine weapons from the Scouring. After clearing out many of the colonization bases, Roy eventually laid siege to the capital of Jutes, where the noble Akkard, responsible for the colonization, was ultimately driven away. Shortly after his victory, Roy received horrifying news that a coup had taken place in the Etrurian capital of Aquileia. King Mordred had been taken captive by a new faction calling themselves the Revolutionaries, led by the corrupt noble Rorts, as well as his partner Akkard, who Roy had just driven off the Isles prior. The Revolutionaries' main objective was to ally Etruria with Byrne, creating a new superpower on Alib. Roy's mission on the Isles was discovered to be merely a distraction to get his army away from the mainland so that the Revolutionaries could rise to power unopposed. Due to their king being held hostage, Knight General Percival and even Great General Douglas were forced to join with the Revolutionaries against their will, but Mage General Cecilia broke off and started a new group called the Loyalists, seeking to oppose Byrne's influence in Etruria. Hurrying back to the mainland, Roy arrived as the Loyalists laid siege to Cecilia's castle near the Missoul Peninsula. Cecilia held out for as long as she could, but when King Sephiel himself showed up to lead the siege, the battle was quickly over, with Sephiel defeating Cecilia in single combats. Roy reached the castle after Sephiel had left, defeating his lieutenant Flair. Inside the castle, Roy found Cecilia being treated by a mysterious girl named Sophia. Sophia, who was actually a half-dragon, informed Roy that Byrne was currently attacking her village of Arcadia in the Nabata Desert, apparently seeking information about the dragons living there. Afraid to let Byrne get their hands on whatever they were seeking, Roy traveled south to the desert and managed to intercept Byrne's forces before they could take the village. After the battle, Roy gathered valuable information about the dragons and the events of the Scouring from the residents of the village. He also met a young divine dragon named Faye, who took a liking to Roy. Upon his departure, Faye disobeyed the village elder and followed his army, hoping to see the world. Once the village of Arcadia was safe, Roy's army marched northeast towards Etruria, but on his way he got word that Faye had been taken by Byrne's forces as she was trying to catch up to him, forcing Roy to come to her rescue. Unable to return to the village of Arcadia at this point, Roy was forced to take the young divine dragon girl with him. In the Etrurian capital of Aquileia, the former Dragon General Narshan was tasked with protecting the castle. Recently demoted from his position by General Murdoch after failing to take the village of Arcadia, Narshan was desperate when Roy's army approached, hoping to redeem himself in the eyes of King Sephiel by routing the invaders. But eventually, Narshan fell in battle against Roy's army, who successfully retook the capital and liberated Etruria from the revolutionaries. Depending on the path taken in the game, Roy's army would either head for Sakai or Ilia, pursuing the remaining revolutionaries led by Akkard and Rorts, and eventually defeating them before attacking Byrne from the north. As Roy's army crossed the border, they eventually clashed with the full strength of Byrne's army at the Shrine of Seals, facing off against legions of Wyvern Knights commanded by Dragon Lord Gale, as well as Byrne's standing army commanded by General Murdoch. It was one of the greatest, longest, and bloodiest battles in Alib's history prior to the Scouring, but eventually the Liberation Army defeated General Murdoch at the Shrine of Seals. Inside the altar, Roy uncovered the legendary sword once wielded by Hartmuch, hero of Byrne, the Binding Blade. Roy's army eventually arrived at Byrne capital and laid siege to the royal castle where King Sephiel resided. After defeating his royal guard, Roy clashed with Sephiel himself inside the throne room. Roy learned that the cause of Sephiel's conquest was to give the world back to the dragons, correcting the course of the Scouring, as Sephiel viewed the human race as evil. Roy tried to talk to him, but was unable to reason with the Mad King and was forced to kill him in battle. Upon the king's death, the Bard Elfin noted that the many divine artifacts Roy's army had uncovered throughout their journey in Eliwood reacted to the presence of the Binding Blade as well as Sephiel's sword, causing them to shine a light in a specific direction, guiding Roy towards the ancient Dragon Temple, where Sephiel's Dark Priestess Aiden still resided. In order to end the war once and for all, Roy had to find the Dark Priestess Aiden. Guided by the divine weapons, Roy sought out the ancient Dragon Temple, but discovered that it was guarded by the remnants of Byrne's forces, led by the last remaining Dragon General, Brunya, who opposed Roy despite King Sephiel's death. Roy tried to convince the Byrne soldiers to lay down their weapons, but they refused to obey. Roy defeated Brunya and ventured into the Dragon Temple. There, he found the remaining war dragons and the enigmatic Jan, a real fire dragon that had hidden himself there since the Scouring. Once Roy brought him down, he found Aidun deep inside the temple, now in her true form as the Demon Dragon. Roy used the Binding Blade to seal Aidun back into her human form and finally took her out of the temple as it collapsed behind him. Roy is an idealistic and kind-hearted young man who seems more concerned with preserving the lives of his soldiers rather than winning a war. He is often criticized by the Fire Emblem community for being somewhat bland, and some people straight out claim that Roy doesn't have a personality at all. While it is true that Roy doesn't really have much of a character arc in the main story and is mostly seen reacting to the events unfolding in the game, the initial translation patch that a lot of people use to play the game for the first time is also not very good, often simplifying sentences, putting Roy into an even blander context. To get a sense of Roy's true personality, we must therefore delve deep into his supports. In his support with Marcus, the veteran paladin is disappointed with the soldiers in Roy's army, calling them weak and unfit for battle, which, considering Roy's starting squad, isn't entirely unwarranted. Marcus wants to be stricter on the new recruits, but Roy denies his requests, telling him that they are trying the best they can. In this support, we learn that Roy is a bit of a softie, and that he's not a fan of strict rules or harsh discipline, and that he prefers to give people space to improve as well as to accommodate for the many different personalities that has joined his army along the journey, rather than trying to force them into becoming stronger. In his support with Alan, Roy is pondering how he can utilize strategies that allow him to win battles without taking casualties. Alan claims that there's no such thing as a war without soldiers dying on both sides, but Roy insists that for a battle to be called a true victory, no casualties can be suffered. This support is interesting because it shows that Roy is a bit of an idealist, refusing to accept the fact that losses are inevitable in a war. At the end of the day, however, I think that the support is most likely a homage to most Fire Emblem players who reset once they lose a single unit. In his support with Lance, we see the loyal Cavalier urging Roy to stay away from the front lines as his life is too valuable compared to the other soldiers. This support trope has been repeated many times in Fire Emblem, and mirrors both Eliwood and Marcus' support in Fire Emblem 7, as well as Seth and Erika's support in Fire Emblem 8, to name a couple. What makes this support different is Roy's remarks about himself in their V support, where he describes himself as not particularly smart or charismatic, and therefore he feels the need to fight to make up for his lacking leadership abilities. This support is rather ironic because I think the developers were most likely trying to portray Roy as humble with this line, but in reality they just made him accurately describe himself. In his support with Volts, Roy is visibly frustrated with his childhood friend for his increasingly distant behavior. We learn that this stemmed from the fact that Volt is behaving more like a servant and less like a friend. When Roy scolds him for sounding too much like Merlinus, Volt takes it as a compliment, but Roy gets mad and tells him to leave. Roy isn't interested in another servant, he wants his childhood friend back, someone he can talk to like an equal. This ends with Roy tricking Volt in his A support, pretending that he's upset with someone else in the army when it's really Volt himself that is the problem, and by the time Volt realizes the truth, Roy has already spilled his feelings and feels better about it. This is one of the few supports where we see Roy get visibly angry and showing a bit of trickery by fooling him, which is a breath of fresh air seeing as most of his other supports are rather bland. This support, while simple, shows a more human side of Roy, a teenager who misses his old life and his old friend. Roy's support with Shanna is one of his more interesting ones. In their talks, Roy questions how Shanna can always act so carefree despite the fact that they are fighting in a war. Shanna tells Roy that it's simply because she eats well, sleeps well, and laughs well, but Roy admits that he cannot keep his mind off the war, and that the thought of losing his soldiers makes him depressed. Again, this shows Roy's struggle as a leader, as the prospects of losing his men terrifies him to the point where he literally suffers from depression. If anything, this shows that Roy isn't really fit to be a leader at all, and that he simply isn't capable of handling the rigors of leading an army, which makes sense, considering he's 15 years old. Roy's support with Sue is not very extensive, and is mainly centered on the young Sakean nomad. In their support, Sue is being sort of a hippie, talking about how she speaks with trees and about how Roy's feel is gradually improving, whatever that means. It ends with Sue giving a bit of sake exposition, after which the two of them fall in love. Roy's support with his canonical pairing Lilina is pretty simple, short and sweet, and doesn't develop either of them in any major ways. They are mostly just concerned about each other, with Roy taking on a slightly more protective role over Lilina, echoing the promise he made to her father Hector before his death. They are both remembering better times, and both of them get a bit nostalgic before they realize that they can't dwell on the past, and towards the end of their A support, Roy makes a grand promise to Lilina that the future will be better, which makes her laugh, because she thinks Roy's acting out of character with his grandstanding. Finally, it ends with the two of them promising that they will always be together. This support is very sweet, and it's just meant to show the two of them bonding and falling in love. Roy's support with Larum is a comical, light-hearted one. Larum is trying to seduce Roy with her dancing and skimpy clothes. She's mainly fishing for compliments and is trying to make him flustered with her flirtatious attitude. Being the confused 15-year-old boy he is, Roy is visibly uncomfortable by her advances and tries his best to avoid her, which makes Larum very upset, as all she really wants is his attention and some validation. This support reveals that Roy is extremely bad with women and that he is not very used to being flirted with. In his support with Cecilia, Roy is struggling with his new role of leadership, seeing as just 1 year earlier he was studying under the Etrurian Mage General as her pupil. Their B support is actually extremely fascinating, as they debate whether or not the player should focus on speed or take their time and turtle. Cecilia debates that Roy shouldn't rush, but take things slowly, whilst Roy claims that they should move forward, as the quicker they move, the more people they will be able to help. Essentially, they're debating whether or not you should get experience or a tactics ranking. I guess Roy is mecha in this particular support. Cecilia eventually agrees that Roy is correct and commends him on his growth. In their A support, Roy actually asks if he can go back to being the student once the war is over, but Cecilia declines, saying that Roy is her equal now. In the support, we yet again see Roy being insecure and unsure about himself, which is a common trend. He desperately wants to go back to his old student-teacher relationship with Cecilia, but he realizes that he can't, so he bones her instead. Yep, how they end up marrying doesn't really make a lot of sense to me either, but that's how it goes down. Finally, Roy's last and final romantic support is with the half-dragon girl Sophia. In their support, Sophia uses her powers of foresight to warn Roy of an impending injury he will suffer on the battlefield, prompting him to be more careful. She is initially sorry for causing him to worry, but Roy is grateful, claiming that her powers most likely saved his life. It's a very simple support and there's not really a lot to it. It serves more of an exposition for Sophia's abilities more than anything else. On a side note, however, I find it fascinating that Roy has a romantic support with a half-dragon, as he himself has a good chance of being one if Eliwood marries Ninian in Blazing Sword. The developers most likely didn't think this far ahead, but I think it's cool nonetheless. So, what can we say about Roy after reading all of his supports? Well, he certainly isn't very impressive, but I think that might be the point. This game focuses a lot on Roy's struggles and his insecurities. He struggles with depression, anxiety, and self-doubt, and seemingly wants to be everywhere but at the head of an army, and yet this is the position he finds himself in. What is fascinating about Roy is the notion that the developers may have made him a weak unit on purpose to reflect his status. His extremely late promotion reflects his inability to grow, and he only really becomes the true hero of the story during the final few chapters of the game. At the end of the day, Roy is an insecure 15-year-old boy who suddenly has the responsibility of the world dumped on his shoulders, and I think the fact that he is painted as an underwhelming and downright average guy is pretty much intentional, and in many ways we can say that Roy is the polar opposite of a Mary Sue character. He is full of flaws and faults, and makes no attempt to hide them, and yet he is the hero of our story, making his journey seem all that much more impressive.
I can't measure up to my father, but if I work hard, I hope I'll become more like him.
Roy is the only Fire Emblem character to appear in a Super Smash Bros. Game before his game was released. Roy has won 2 different popularity contests in Japan, where he ranked as the #1 most popular Binding Blade character. Roy ranked number 52 in the official Choose Your Legends Heroes popularity poll, and number 88 in the second. Roy can marry up to 6 different women in Binding Blade: Lilina, Shanna, Sue, Larum, Cecilia, and Sophia. Roy shares his English voice actor in Heroes, Ray Chase, with Alphonse, Gaius, and Fernand.
I have faith in the goodness of humankind, no matter what.
After the war, Sephiel's sister Guinevere takes over leadership of Bern, and Roy himself returns home to Farah, and after his father Eliwood's death, takes over as the new Marcus, settling down with one of his 6 potential wives. Roy rules with much love from his subjects and is fondly remembered by the Lycian people, even long after his reign.
I want to repay all those who have supported me.
Roy is one of those units that sparks a lot of debate in the Fire Emblem community on a regular basis. His popularity prompts people to defend his usefulness, while others claim that he has some massive issues as a unit. Which one of them is right? To find out, let's delve deep into Roy's statistics. Being one of the main characters of the game, Roy is available from the first chapter, and is the only unit to be force deployed throughout the entire game. Furthermore, every single chapter in Binding Blade save the very final one is a throne seize, meaning that Roy must always reach a certain point of the map in order to clear it. If a player only chooses to focus on Roy's growth rates, he doesn't look all that bad. All of his base stats save his resistance are well balanced for a level 1 unit, and the growths are good in most areas by Binding Blade standards, ranging from 40 to 50% in most areas. But Roy has a few crucial flaws that absolutely cripple his performance, his 2 biggest ones being that he is a sword-locked unit with no mounts. Being locked to swords is a big detriment in Binding Blade, as ranged swords are both weak and incredibly rare, with rune swords being enemy only, and only a single light brand being obtainable in chapter 23. Due to being stuck at 5 move and being required to seize thrones, Roy is also often busy moving from point A to point B, or being transported by a faster unit like Marcus or Shanna, especially taking Binding Blade's huge maps into consideration. Even if the player doesn't care about playing quickly, being stuck at 5 move is still a huge detriment for Roy, as it means that he often needs to be rescued away from sticky situations. Roy may still appear like a decent unit considering Binding Blade's early game is filled with axe-wielding units with shaky hit rates, but while Roy has a decent chance of dodging their attacks, he still struggles dealing any meaningful damage back to them in return, as his speed is just bad enough so that he doesn't reliably double, which makes his damage output early game absolutely horrendous. Also, Roy's early game durability is awful as well, as he always risks retaliation damage with his sword, and most of the early game soldiers, mercenaries and cavaliers will kill him in 2 hits, or a single one if he has already taken damage from an enemy archer. On hard mode, Roy's early game is even more atrocious. While he may have been capable of performing somewhat decently on normal mode with a few lucky level ups, most enemies on hard mode will outright murder him. Even most of the brigands and fighters have hit rates going above 50%, meaning that dodging their attacks is not a reliable strategy at all. Roy does come with the fire affinity, which is seen as the most useful one in the game. Binding Blade supports are horrendously slow and you won't unlock them unless you really try, with the exception of Roy and Lilina's C support, which is pretty much instant. If you don't mind waiting a bunch and taking your time, Roy can build some decent supports with the early game powerhouses like Marcus, Alan and Lance, though with his 5 move he will not always be within range to help them, but for players who enjoy a slower pace, Roy's fire affinity can be of great help in some of the tedious early game chapters, particularly on hard mode. Roy comes with his own personal weapon, the Rapier, which is pretty much an iron sword with a bit of extra hit and crit added onto it, alongside effective damage against knights and cavaliers. Binding Blade's triple effective damage multiplier makes the Rapier more useful than its blazing sword counterpart, though that doesn't say a lot. With the Rapier, Roy can take roughly about half the health of an enemy cavalier on normal mode, or a third of their health on hard mode, and this is useful as the early game is filled with these guys. Against armor knights, the Rapier will rarely do much considering their sky-high defenses, so don't expect Roy to do much against them. One of the Rapier's prime issues alongside its low base might is the fact that it faces weapon triangle disadvantage against nearly all the enemies it is effective against, seeing as most cavaliers in Binding Blade wield lances, effectively cutting its might by 3 against such foes. Also keep in mind that the Rapier will not deal effective damage against troubadors and nomads in this game, which is particularly frustrating in Chapter 4 where this would have been extremely useful. You're able to obtain a second Rapier from a chest in Chapter 7, though chances are that in most regular playthroughs you won't even break your first one. Even if you take care to feed Roy a lot of early game kills to make up for his shaky bases, his arguably biggest detriment is that he will not be able to promote until the end of chapter 21 or 21X if you unlock it. If you obtain every single guidance chapter to unlock the game's best ending, which most players do, Roy will be forced to walk around with 5 move and stat caps of 20 for a grand total of 27 chapters, and even a very RNG blessed Roy will be pretty useless in chapter 1 against promoted Wyvern Lords. By the time he picks up the Binding Blade and gets his story-based promotion, most units in your army will be well past their own ones. All things considered, a promoted Roy certainly will be able to hold his own in the late game. His promotion gains are high and he gets a powerful ranged personal sword, but considering he's been waiting for 27 chapters to get to this point, you would think he'd get something more impressive out of it. Speaking of said powerful ranged personal sword, the Binding Blade is an extremely strong ranged sword with a ridiculous base might of 18, meaning that Roy can one-round any Manakit he goes up against, even on hard mode, and even at base he can two-shot the final boss with it. The Binding Blade also gives Roy some much needed bulk with 5 extra defense and resistance, which certainly helps. You can also use it as an item to heal Roy for 30 hit points, but this isn't really recommended. You should have plenty of elixirs available at this point anyway. Be wary of its limited 20 uses. If it breaks, you won't be able to obtain the best ending, though you can hammer it. Overall, Roy has many challenges to overcome, and not many viable tools to tackle them. Sadly, he is mostly a complete liability for a majority of the game. While some players will swear by his usefulness due to his popularity and because he sort of kicks ass in the final chapters with his burning sword, the sad reality is that Roy is probably a candidate for worst lord in the series. I wish it wasn't the case, but it's difficult to argue otherwise, though I know that won't stop you guys from trying, so bring it on, comment section.
I know I can rely on you completely.
Roy is not a particularly interesting character. Binding Blade focuses mostly on its overarching story and the events that transpires in the world, and not so much on Roy himself as a character, and this game's supports are a lot shorter and less meaningful than the later ones. Still, Roy has a humanity to his character that I find charming. Binding Blade focuses a lot on Roy being a young boy who struggles a lot with the burden of leadership and his own insecurities. It's not that Binding Blade is the only game to do this, but with Roy, it's sort of emphasized in a different way. A thing that is often overlooked with Binding Blade, but still worth noting, is that characters in this game does not blink or change their facial expressions during dialogue like they do in the later games, and this makes Roy appear a lot less emotional, having the same facial expression regardless of what's going on. If we saw Roy doing things like being upset, happy, sad, or even blushing, I think a lot of people would view him in a more positive light. Combine this with the fact that Binding Blade's original translation sorta sucks, and the fact that Roy has no other lords to really talk with during the story, so he's stuck talking with characters like Merlinus and Guinevere for the most part. And hey, it's no secret I love me some Guinevere, but she ain't exactly what I would call an interesting conversation partner. For comparison, imagine how Eliwood would have fared in Fire Emblem 7 without Lyn or Hector at his side. And I mean, even with them, he is still often attacked for being every bit as bland as his son. For these reasons, despite Roy being on the boring side, I will give him a generous 3-star rating in this department. Based on his own merits, I don't think he warrants any higher than a 2-star rating, but all these minor things combined is enough for me to bump him up a little. This is, without question, Roy's strongest trait, and I think that his unique design is what made people so curious about him in the first place, as even in Super Smash, a really colorful game, Roy really stands out from the crowd with his blue color scheme, stylish cape, fiery red hair, and of course, his big flaming ass sword. I don't think Roy's design is perfect, but it certainly leaks better than most of his other aspects, and honestly, I think it's what makes him a fan favorite in the community to this day. 4 out of 5 stars. After spending the entire statistics segment tearing into Roy as a unit, I feel like I'm pouring salt in the wounds of the Roy fans with my upcoming rating, but I really can't help myself. Roy is a sword-locked, foot-locked unit with shaky bases and awful survivability. His promotion is late, and even as a Master Lord, he doesn't do anything spectacular aside from being able to kill Manakits and one-run the final boss. Roy is arguably one of the worst lords in the series, and competes with being one of the worst units in Binding Blade overall. A pretty awful spot to be in, but that's the son of Eliwood for you. 1 out of 5 stars. Sorry, Roy fanboys. I know Roy will always be your boy. Thank you so much for watching this Fire Emblem character spotlight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider helping out this video with a like, and let me know what character you want to see me feature in a future spotlight by leaving a comment below. I would like to give a big thank you to Flashing Knives, who requested this spotlight of Roy alongside this drawing as his silver tier reward. By becoming a silver tier Patreon, you too can request your very own spotlight and drawing. Before we end this video, I want to give a massive shout out to my amazing Patreon supporters. You guys are the best and I really appreciate each and every one of you. You make it possible for me to produce all this Fire Emblem content for you all on a daily basis, especially now that YouTube is demonetizing videos left, right and center for seemingly no reason at all. If you become a Patreon supporter today, you get instant access to my Patreon-only Discord chat, the ability to participate in Patreon Hangouts, and ask questions from my Patreon Q&A videos. Also, if you become a silver tier Patreon, you can request your very own Fire Emblem character spotlight, alongside a drawing of your favorite Fire Emblem character done personally by my designer. You can check out our Instagram or Facebook page by clicking the link in the video description to see some of the work she's done previously. She is extremely talented. Also, my two script readers, Tsurugi and Heliasan, help me with the fine-tuning of the script of the spotlight, along with Mecha, who also assists with correcting errors and mistakes. Anyway, that's all for now. If you want to see more spotlights, check out the playlist linked in front of you. There's also another direct link which will take you to the previous spotlight I did. Anyway, my name is Mangs. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. You are a true fan. Don't forget to leave that like, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.